Now let's look at the RMB internationalization and how this connects to the Chinese economic transformation. It's a very important question because for a lot of think tanks that are looking at the very, very big picture, they are thinking about what will China 2.0 look like and what is the impact of the new China. China 1.0 is when China became the factories of the world, and many advanced economies have have seen their jobs in the factories move to China, and a lot of blue collar jobs were taken away. China 2.0 involved the question of whether China would successfully transform itself from the factory stage to the knowledge stage. If they're able to successfully move to the knowledge stage, then they would be attracting or creating a lot of white collar jobs. Will this increase in white collar jobs in China supplement the white collar jobs in the advanced economies? Or will it take away jobs from the advanced economy, just like what had happened to the factory jobs? So this is the very, very big picture in terms of the Chinese economic transformation, and it is connected to the RMB internationalization policy. When we think about a big picture scenario like this, we have to examine the data because data and story must go together. It is an interesting story to talk about the Chinese transformation. What data do we have? What are the data that drive the thinking? In the Chinese case, it is unique because of the huge population. 1.3, 1.4 billion people is a lot of people. Right? And we then examine the population in terms of their skill level. And you could also examine the leadership to see where their priorities are and in terms of their determination of getting things done. China 1.0 will be in the history book. It is a big event. It's an industry disruption. The question then is, will China 2.0 be another of this big event? Just like the factories and the factory workers who were not prepared when China 1.0 came in, the question then is, will the white collar people be unprepared if and when China 2.0 take place? And what happened to the emerging economies? What happened to their stock and bond market and the currency? Will they benefit? Will the emerging economy benefit from the new China? Or will they lose market share? When we look at data and when we look at a chart like this, the human tendency is to extrapolate the trend. But this is not a good way of thinking about industry disruption. global disruption. A better way is to look at the different scenarios by beginning to understand what are the scenario drivers. Under what condition of various drivers will we get this best scenario A? Under what condition will we get the worst case? And it's also very important to be able to think out of the box, because when there is the possibility of discontinuity, then things can change dramatically. A very good example would be if you were to track the book sales of Barnes and Noble pre-Amazon. Right? You might be tempted to think that within the trend. But with Amazon coming in, there was a serious discontinuity. And that changes everything. It's important to think like this because according to Robert Rubin, former head of Goldman Sachs and former Treasury Secretary, right, he explained that his way of thinking is all decisions are about probabilities. Under what condition will we get scenario A? What is the probability? Under what scenario do we get the worst case? What is the probability? And so on. So, with this framework, we are asking under what condition will China create a discontinuity in the system? I mentioned just now that China is very, very big. But it's very difficult really to visualize how big China is. Maybe this could help. This is a population of top cities in China, in Europe, and in America. And what I want to do next is to line up the graph and bring your attention to the 10 million people mark. Look at how many cities in China have more than 10 million people. And when you look at Chongqing and Shanghai and Beijing, we are looking at more than 20 million to about 30 million people. Many people have not heard of Chongqing. Right? It has almost 30 million people. And when we look at the 10 million mark, you see a few large cities here. And when you compare these 10 million people cities in China with the top European countries, we see that London and Paris barely get close to 10 million. And in the United States, we only have New York City, right? That is close to 10 million, but not quite. So China is a country with a lot of people. And what happened in China can tilt the global system. The problem with having a lot of people is China is constantly like trying to figure out how do they manage order. Because order can very quickly become chaos. Right? So obviously, for the global system to work effectively, we would prefer an orderly China instead of a chaotic China. But when policies are changing, there's always a chance of something going wrong. China has no choice but to transform its economy because the potential GDP of China is declining. It used to be about 10% back in the middle of 2000. And by the time we get close to 2020, China potential GDP has fallen down to 6%. One main reason for the declining potential GDP is the aging population. And according to this chart here from the Economist magazine, working age people needed to immigrate or emigrate by 2030 to keep dependency ratio at 2016. And China is this orangey color here, 20 to 30%. That means that in order to maintain the dependency ratio, i.e., the number of workers supporting the number of retirees, China have to bring in 20 to 30% of its workforce. This is quite dramatic, okay, because you then have to imagine that in an office of 10 people, 2 or 3 would be non-Chinese. And what do they do? What skill set would they bring in? Well, China has no choice but to think seriously about attracting foreign talent because they had tried very hard to increase their population. And they have relaxed the one-child policy and encouraged families to have the second child. But if you look at the number of births across time, you will see only a small increase in the number of babies. The interesting thing is that when we look at the number of second child, we see a nice improvement. The problem is when we look at the number of first child, we are seeing a big drop. So a very important question then here is what is common among members of this group? Why are these couples having no children or delaying having their first child? Are they from the poor and middle class? In that case, then this might be solved by some form of financial incentive or financial support to help these poor and middle class couples uh, to uh, to to share their financial burden of having a child. Maybe it is the thinking of a new generation of people who don't want to have children. That would be a harder problem to solve. Right? So this is where people who understand cluster analysis, they can do wonderful work to try to uncover what is happening here. And only by understanding the problem, then the appropriate solution can be derived. China is transforming its economy. And as you can see from this chart here, in the past, China relies a lot on this purple histogram. Right? China relies a lot on investment as the driving force for the economy. Over time, the investment component has come down, and the hope is that China can transform itself into a more consumption oriented economy. So less investment, more consumption. The trouble with consumption is that it has it there are two forms of getting consumption. One is through workers borrowing money to spend. The second method is from workers earning more money. When we look at this chart here, this is China small and medium enterprises average wage growth. They employ the most number of people. Back in 2007 and 8, the year-on-year wage growth for this group is between 12 to 15% year on year. Then fast forward to 2016-17, the wage growth is significantly less. Let's say moving forward, wage growth stay at about 5%. And potential GDP in China is 6%. And in order to create a more consumption-oriented economy, consumption have to grow higher than potential GDP, let's say 7%. Then when consumption is growing faster than wages, what happens is that savings must drop or borrowing will have to rise. Clearly, relying on less saving or more borrowing to create more consumption is not sustainable. So China has no choice but to search for ways to increase wages. And this is why they need to transform their economy away from the factory jobs to the knowledge related jobs. The pressure is very intense because China can no longer rely on the factory for future job creation. The factory costs, the wages in the wages in the manufacturing sector in China is now a lot more expensive compared to countries like Vietnam, as you can see on this chart here. When I was looking at this chart, I couldn't believe what I saw. Like this was back in 2015. The average compensation cost for manufacturing workers, this red line here, China has been rising. And yes, we know that it's been rising, but the fact that it has increased more than the wages in Mexico is quite surprising to many people, meaning that it is now more expensive to have goods manufactured in China than in Mexico. So therefore, it makes a lot of sense for the automakers to shift their production away from China to Mexico. First, to benefit from the cheaper labor costs in Mexico, and secondly, if the distance is closer, and they save on transportation and the speed to market as well. Around the same time, there was this news article. Chinese textile mills are now hiring in places where cotton was king. This is a news about a Chinese textile mill moving their factory to the United States. And that's because while the labor cost in China is less than the labor cost in the United States, when we look at the total all-in cost, we can see that in terms of the raw or an auxiliary material, the US has a clear advantage. And therefore, on a total cost basis, it makes sense for this Chinese textile company to move to the United States. Then finally, we are seeing more and more robots installed in China. As early as 2014, we already know that things have changed. Because when we look at the numbers back in 2008, you look at the average automated guided vehicle, it costs 120,000 renminbi or Chinese yuan. And you can compare this with the salary per worker, 24,000, right? And the total labor cost of 49,000. So the payback period, 120,000 divided by 49, is about 3 years. Fast forward to 2014, the payback period has fallen down to only 1.1 years. Right. Similar calculation for the linear robot for injection molding machine. Payback period was 5.7 years and fallen down to 1.3 years. So there's a lot of pressure for factories in China to move on to robots. And what happened to the workers working there? Can they still get their 5% pay rise? Hardly. In fact, they'll be lucky if they can keep their job. So as China moves from the industrial and shifting away from factory jobs, China need not rely on the fixed exchange rate system. As they move towards the consumption base, perhaps there's a strong argument for China to want to have a strong renminbi policy. This concludes this segment here.